So I will start with a couple of announcements about the class in general. Last night, I went through and I graded all the response paragraphs that I have received. I also went into Moodle and I fiddled around with the grade book so that it should be showing your grade accurately. Now, I don't think I'm invading Chanmi's privacy to say yours will be different, and you and I will talk about that. So you don't bother with the grade book. But for the two of you, at the end of today, I'll give you the grade for submitting the questions during class, which will be 100 for both of you, unless you just skip submitting questions today. That's the only, well, actually, there's one more response paragraph assignment, and that I set to come due not tonight, but tomorrow night. If that's not enough time, you could email me and tell me you would like more time, and I would be pretty sympathetic. I don't think my grades are due right away. So that is where we are right now. And today is going to be different from the previous 4 days in content because an ethical teacher does not take any topic and only talk about the positives of it. And I realized if I was going to come and I was going to use Christianity to try to explain certain things about how Westerners communicate and spend all these class meetings giving a very positive case, a very positive description of Christianity, there were some topics that could come up that people might have heard of when it comes to Christianity, and they might think, well, why didn't he mention any of those? There's a long list I could have included. I narrowed it down to just 2, and we will do one this morning, and we will do one after lunch. And then our final session is going to be the final things to say from this entire class. But this morning, well, let me start what we're going to talk about this morning. Yesterday, when we were talking about health communication, Fabi-san and I had one quick little exchange when what I remember you saying is you would hope that doctors would have compassion and the best interest of their patients at heart. And I said, oh, there are some awful doctors out there. Now, I will keep this short because it's not a cheerful subject. But right now, in the United States, there's a very famous gynecologist in New York City who's been accused of long-term sexual abuse of 9 of his patients, and they are putting him on trial for sex trafficking. Also, within just the past couple of weeks, in the middle of the United States, there's a report out that 250 doctors have sexually abused or harassed 440 patients. A few years ago, the team doctor for the American Olympic gymnastics team, a man named Larry Nassar, was put on trial and sentenced to life in prison because for years he had sexually abused the athletes. And finally, there's a team doctor from one of the largest universities in the United States, Ohio State University. His name is Richard Strauss, and I believe that he's actually died by now. But a number of athletes came forward and said, male athletes, that he had groped them, sexually abused them, even sometimes forcibly raped them. There were over 200 of them. So, there are some really awful doctors out there. I say that to lay the foundation for this. My original academic specialty was the particular social institution, what did I do with my marker, called a profession. If what you do for a living is a profession, then you are a professional. And one of the biggest differences is in English in the United States, if someone asks you what your job is, if you're not a professional, You often will use the words, this is what I do. I drive an Uber. I work in a grocery store. But if you are a professional, you'll say what you are, that is what you are. At the beginning, way, way back of the professions, there were four. Just four professions. There are a lot more now, but these are the four classic professions. Doctor. So you wouldn't say, I work in medicine. You would say, I am a doctor. The second was lawyer. If you were a lawyer, you were a professional. The third was teacher. So I would be a professional, according to one of the original definitions. And I've been doing this all week, and you've been doing really, really well. Based on what this session is going to be about, what do you think the fourth one was? Who are we talking about in this session?
Politicians?
Politicians is after lunch. Clergy, religious leaders, they were the fourth profession. Now, what made a job a profession was the following things. You had knowledge that not everybody else had. It could be medicine, it could be law, it could be the Bible, or it could be what you taught. But you had knowledge not everybody else had. If you drive an Uber, you don't have knowledge other people don't have, you just have a car and a phone. People in professions also said, what we do is so special that outsiders can't judge whether we do it right. So if you say your doctor they're wrong about a question on medicine, they might say to you, well, where did you go to medical school? And when doctors are sued for malpractice, other doctors will come and testify in the lawsuit. Because if you just say, well, I think the doctor was wrong, the doctor will say, you're not a doctor, you can't decide whether I did my job right. Based on what I just said, that you can only be evaluated or judged by your fellow professionals. If you want to be a doctor, you have to have a license to practice medicine. And if you misbehave, they can take your license away. Now, one of the things that can be a little scary sometimes, there are very often new forms of health care or health practice, sometimes called alternative health care or health practice. Some of them work very well. Some of the people who practice them are very honest and ethical. But for the ones who aren't, the ones who are dishonest, and the ones who might abuse their patients, there's no license, there's no regulation. Their patients could go to the police and say, this is what happened, but doctors often have so much power over their patients that the patient will think that they won't be believed, which is why it's important that doctors have very, very strict and careful standards of behavior. And if a doctor breaks that standard, they could lose their license. Now, we talked about health communication yesterday, but I'm building up to our discussion today of church. Because everything I've just said about doctors is also true of clergy, of religious leaders. Churches, Christian churches, they have organizations, they have ways of organizing, many of them described in the Bible, that are supposed to protect the members from being mistreated by the leaders. You have heard me several times quote a man named Tim Keller. The particular religious group he belongs to, the name for it is Presbyterian. And the word that comes from presby means elder, older person. And it's widely practiced in Christianity that a church will have one leader, usually called a preacher or a pastor, but also elders, several people chosen from the church who are older in age. They have been practicing maturing Christians for a long time. And if the pastor does something wrong, they had the authority to tell the pastor to stop. If they had to, they could even remove the pastor from the church. That is meant to protect the members of the church. The same way losing your license as a doctor is meant to protect your patients from you misbehaving. In the Roman Catholic Church, the priest who meets with the members in the parish has to answer to the bishop. The bishop answers to the archbishop. The archbishop answers to the pope. There are people who have authority to observe behavior and evaluate it and tell someone to stop. But you heard me say there are alternative forms of healthcare practice that are not licensed, where if you misbehave, there's not really anyone who can make you stop. And something that's happened in the United States very much in the last about 30 years. There's a movement in Christianity called church planting. And as a result, there are quite a few churches that we now call mega churches. A church is a mega church if every week at least 2,000 people attend. Some churches have more than 10,000 members attend every week. We call those giga churches. In 1970, when I was 1 year old, in the United States, the total number of mega churches, there were only 10 of them. By 2011, there were 1,200 mega churches. Now, around that same time, there were a lot of businesses, technology businesses, that changed the economy, first in the United States and then in the rest of the world, and they were led very commonly by a very intelligent person who often dropped out of college. Microsoft was led by Bill Gates. Facebook was led by Mark Zuckerberg. Apple was led by Steve Jobs. And that became a very, very popular model. And a lot of students, business students and computer students, began dropping out of college to start their own company in a place in California called Silicon Valley. And the interesting thing is, when you're 19 years old and you start a company and the company makes you a billionaire, and you are still the leader of that company, it's not always clear that you have the maturity and the judgment to handle that much global power. And Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook has made a lot of decisions that, looking back, were probably not good decisions. I bring all of that up to say, these church planting megachurches, they're not part of a denomination. They are not Presbyterian, they're not Catholic, they're not, some of the others are Methodist, Baptist. All the denomination churches that are part of a group, if the pastor misbehaves, someone else will speak up and make them stop. But in these mega churches, there's no protection. If the pastor decides what's going to happen, no one can tell the pastor, you can't do that. There was one megachurch that began in Seattle, not too far from where I live, the town where Starbucks was founded. It was called Mars Hill, and it was one of the largest. It had 5,000 people attending every week, and then it started, this is often something big church plants do, they would build another building and say, this is also part of our church, even though it might be 20 miles away. They would live stream the preaching to this building and then start another one, and each of these buildings would have thousands of people attending, and it's all one church. The pastor of this church was named Mark Driscoll, and at first he had elders because he had grown up in a church that had elders. But they tried to tell him some of the things he was doing were not a good idea. He fired them. And when he fired his elders, nobody could stop him. After a few years, the membership of the church made it clear to this pastor, Mark Driscoll, that he was emotionally abusing people. He was being very cruel to people who worked for him. He was screaming and yelling, making people very miserable. And finally, they forced him to leave the church. But it took a very, very long time. All right. That's all just about kind of the machinery of a church, the working of a church. What is the nature of the problem? Well, the nature of the problem, there are lots and lots, there have been reported lots and lots of churches where finally, after years of misconduct, a pastor has been shown to either be like Mark Driscoll, to be very emotionally abusive and cruel, or worse, to be like the doctors I described, to be a sexual abuser. Sometimes, I don't want to call it minor or small, but sometimes it is just they were unfaithful to their wife and they had an affair. Now that's not okay. But in some of the situations, they've been involved in sex with people who are underage, and sometimes more than one. And it's happened enough times that it's really kind of a troubling pattern. What is happening in these church plant churches commonly is that the leaders feel very powerful. Now, one thing that I'm kind of not, I should have at the beginning said, one of the things I am not in a position to talk that much about is there have also been a lot of incidents of sexual abuse, some with adults, some with children, in Catholic churches. But that is a problem that spans lots of parts of the world and goes back hundreds of years. Its biggest root, likely, is the requirement that if you become a Catholic priest, you have to go without any sexual contact for life. Now, the Bible teaches God gives some people the gift that they do not need to have a sex life. We call that celibacy. You can go your entire life, not have sex. But some people choose to become priests or nuns, and then they find out they don't have that gift. And they may have been pressured into making the choice to become a priest or a nun in the first place. That is one of the major causes of the widely reported sexual abuse from Catholic clergy and from, Catholic clergy. I bring this up because what I'm describing is a more American problem. And I make it sound like there's Catholics and then there's Americans, and that's far from true. The Catholic Church is huge in the United States. What I mean to say is the church plant and the mega church, that's a little bit more of a homegrown American thing. That's a problem that has its roots in how Christianity has grown up in the United States. And one other thing I should say. there are scandals, there are problems that show up at churches that are not mega churches, churches that are not church plants. Those happen. But the track record is, the history of those situations, those problems, those churches have something in place to catch people misbehaving like that and to deal with it. They do it poorly sometimes. They do it wrong sometimes. But the difference is in a church plant, there may be nothing in place to try to limit misbehavior by the leaders. All right. A lot of what I am talking about here comes from two researchers. There's Glenn Starks, who is a professor of public administration. And then there is Mark Lasser, who originally was the leader of a church. He was a pastor. And he had a problem with sexual misbehavior, and his church fired him. He then went to graduate school and became a counselor and went on for his doctorate in counseling, and he works now with pastors who have a problem with sexual misconduct. And he tries to help them put their life back together or to stop something that they feel tempting them before they misbehave. That became his specialty. Based on that, Professor Lasser has done a fair amount of work on what it looks like when a pastor is at risk, or when the members of the church are at risk that the pastor is going to misbehave. He says there are 6 profiles. There's the naive prince, which is his word for a pastor who is brand new and has not enough experience. And some of the church members are very attractive. And because the pastor is immature and inexperienced, he may pay extra attention, or she. There are plenty of female pastors in mega churches that are planted. They may pay too much attention, have too much involvement with members of their church who are attractive, and things just get out of control. Professor Lasser says, second, there is the wounded warrior. The wounded warrior. Commonly, there are pastors who in their childhood, something happened that hurt them emotionally, and now what they do is by leading their church, they try to show everybody how good they are. They therefore work so hard at leading their church that they neglect their family and their spouse. And then someone in the church who also probably works too hard will step into that relationship. So the first is the immature pastor. The second is the pastor who's working too hard. The third profile, Lasser says, is there are pastors who think that they are not appreciated for all the work that they do, and they decide that they have earned the right to have a sexual relationship with a member of the church. Those first 3, what they do can be really, really devastating, crushing to the members of their church. But you can almost see there was nothing malicious. They themselves just needed to get help and not be trusted with the leadership position they were in. The other 3 profiles, well, 2 of the last 3, it's hard to have much compassion for. Lasser said a fair number of pastors are what he called the false lover. The false lover. They're very talented, and they know that they can charm anybody. they can be so attractive to other people that over and over again they get the very pleasant experience of meeting new people, being attractive, and have those people like them. And they almost get to where they're addicted to that feeling, winning people over. And he says, when a pastor like that enters into a relationship with a member of the church, usually they very quickly get tired of them and want someone new. So they'll go from person to person to person and maybe have lots of inappropriate sexual affairs and leave a lot of suffering behind them. And Lasser said finally, well, I said there are 6. This is the 5th. There's one that he called the dark king. And he said, this kind of pastor, and there are not very many, this kind of pastor is a sociopath. Loves feeling powerful. And can quote the Bible and can day to day look like a very good Christian, but has a hobby of singling out attractive church members and having affairs with them and getting away with it. Those exist, and that's deeply disturbing. The last one, this one I find almost the most intriguing. Lasser called this last one the wild card. He said there are some pastors who have a mental health condition and they get treated for it. And the treatment works enough that they can go back to their job and they can start leading the church again. But when the mental illness reappears, the way they act out is they will go and have a sexual contact with a church member. And it's usually completely unexpected. It surprises everybody in the church. The last couple of thoughts, and this chiefly comes from Glenn Starks, the professor of public administration. He said, a lot of the pastors in large planted churches who don't have enough safeguards in place to control their behavior, what they tend to do is they want more and more control. They want nobody to question the decisions they make. If someone asks a question, is this a good idea? Should we do this? They get angry and defensive. They often have poor impulse control. They act without talking to anybody else, sometimes making really big decisions that other people should have had discussed with them. Starks winds up by saying, just the same as with entertainers, just the same as with government officials or business leaders, the chief cause is power. The fact that these leaders of churches are so powerful is what makes them misbehave this way. Sometimes, he says, it's just power by itself. Sometimes it's job stress or burnout. Sometimes it's a troubled marriage. And when it's job stress, burnout, or a troubled marriage, people who have that but are not powerful, they'll find another way to try to cope with the pain of job stress, burnout, or a troubled marriage. But when you're the leader of a church, the way you can deal with it when you have that much power can really, really devastate the people who belong to the church. All right. Tim Keller had 1 or 2 thoughts, and then I'm going to walk out there where it's cold. That's why I didn't take my hoodie off, while you write down your questions. Tim Keller said, that right now, this time in our history, the 2020s, so many people are confused about spiritual questions. So many people are ready to say, well, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, and I'm looking for higher meaning in my life, and they're confused. So when they find a church that's led by someone who speaks very powerfully and has a lot of charisma, a lot of personal magnetism, that right now is very, very popular with people who are confused. We've said this before in talking about heuristics. When people are confused, they want something that makes the answer look simple. And that can mean a pastor, a religious leader who's a very good speaker, has a very attractive personality, and seems to have some really clear answers. And Keller also says, and this is a fair point, there are churches out there who are not like church plant churches. They're not like startups, but they are very institutionalized. They've been around for a very long time, and they pretty much exist only so the people who work there can have a secure job. There are churches like that in the United States. There are churches like that in Europe. And churches, in trying not to make that mistake, sometimes lean too far in the other direction and try to stay young and dynamic and active, and they will make all these mistakes. So, I put this into this class as a topic in organizational communication. And I teach from time to time organizational communication. How can organizations design who talks to who has to get permission before making a decision? How can they build that into their organization so that they do what they set out to do and they don't create problems? A lot of evangelical Christian churches in the United States have a major organizational communication problem. And the way that is showing itself is with a lot of church members who are abused, emotionally abused, too often sexually abused. So if and when you hear news reports about another scandal of this kind coming from a Christian church, and you think, what in the world? You know, the Bible's supposed to teach people out of gratitude for the gift that was given to them to make every decision in a way that God would be proud of them. What's with all these religious leaders abusing their followers? This is what it is. A lot of it. Not 100%, but a lot of it. The big bulk of it that keeps showing up in news reporting. Okay. I have now spun down to say everything I want to say. Let me kill the recorder.